In the middle of the Second World War, a Jewish family of 5 vanished from a small village in occupied Europe, and for 3 long years, everyone who had ever known them believed they were dead. But they were not dead. They were alive. They were breathing, sleeping, whispering, eating, and praying in a space no bigger than a single room, hidden beneath the floorboards of a convent chapel, and the only reason any of them survived to see the end of the war was a nun named Sister Agnes, a woman who made one impossible decision on a freezing night, a decision that should have cost her everything she had. Before the war, Sister Agnes was the kind of person nobody really noticed. She was quiet. She kept her head bowed during prayers. She scrubbed the chapel floor until the stones gleamed, and she tended the small vegetable garden behind the convent walls with hands that were cracked and rough from years of work. She had entered the convent as a young woman, not because she was running from anything, but because she had always felt most at peace in silence, most useful when no one was watching. The other sisters knew her as dependable, serious, and sometimes a little too serious. She rarely laughed. She rarely spoke above a murmur. If you had asked anyone in that convent who among them would one day carry the weight of 5 hidden lives on her shoulders, Sister Agnes would have been the very last name on the list. And that, as it turned out, is exactly why she was the perfect person for it. Because the people who do the bravest things in this world are almost never the ones shouting about it. They are the ones who simply decide, in a single quiet moment, that some things are more important than their own safety, and then they never look back. The Rosen family lived on the edge of the village in a modest house with a red door, and before the war, they were as ordinary as any family could be. Samuel Rosen was a watchmaker, a patient man with spectacles that were always slipping down his nose, and people came from 3 towns over just to have him repair a broken clock because he was that good with his hands. His wife Leah kept a warm kitchen, and she was known in the village for the bread she baked every Friday, a dark, dense loaf that smelled like honey and caraway. They had 2 children, a bright-eyed 7-year-old daughter named Hannah and a 5-year-old son named Jacob, a boy who was always running, always asking questions, always leaving his shoes in the doorway where everyone tripped over them. They were not rich, and they were not powerful. They were just a family. And when the occupation began, that was all it took to make them a target. At first, the changes were small and easy to pretend away. A rule here, a restriction there. Samuel could no longer keep his shop. Jacob could no longer go to school. Neighbors who used to wave from their doorsteps began to cross the street instead, and Leah told herself it was only fear, that it would pass, that surely the world would come to its senses. But the world did not come to its senses. It got darker. And one afternoon, a woman Leah had known since childhood, a woman who had once traded bread recipes with her over the garden fence, walked right past her on the street and did not meet her eyes. That was the day Leah understood. That was the day she knew they could not stay. The knock came late on a winter night, after the village had gone still and the snow was falling so thick it swallowed every sound. Sister Agnes was the one who heard it, because she was the one who could not sleep, because some part of her had been awake for weeks, waiting for something she could not name. When she opened the heavy wooden door of the convent, the cold rushed in like a living thing, and there, standing in the doorway with snow dusting their shoulders, were Samuel and Leah Rosen, holding their sleeping children in their arms. Leah's face was raw from the cold and from tears, and she did not waste a single word on explanation. She simply said, in a voice so quiet Sister Agnes had to lean in to hear it, that they had nowhere left to go. That the trucks had come for the family down the road the night before. That by morning, the soldiers would come for them too. Sister Agnes stood in that doorway for a long moment, and she understood with perfect, terrible clarity what was being asked of her. If she turned them away, they would almost certainly die, and she would have to live with that for the rest of her life. If she let them in, every nun in this convent would be risking execution, because hiding a Jewish family was a crime punishable by death not just for her, but for everyone who knew. She looked down at Hannah's small face, peaceful in sleep, and then she looked at Leah, a mother who had run out of every option except this one. And Sister Agnes did the thing that would define the rest of her life. She stepped back, opened the door wide, and let them in. What Sister Agnes did not know, standing there in that frozen doorway, was that the hardest part was not the decision. The hardest part was everything that came after. Because you cannot simply hide 5 people in a convent full of nuns, a convent where people come and go, where soldiers search, where the walls themselves seemed to have ears. The Rosen family could not stay in a spare room, not even for one night, because one wrong glance through a window, one overheard footstep, one child's cough at the wrong moment, and it would all be over. So Sister Agnes went to the Mother Superior, a stern woman named Mother Catherine who had been running the convent with an iron will for 30 years, and she told her the truth. She expected to be refused. She expected to be told that the safety of the convent came first, that the risk was too great, that this was not their war to fight. But Mother Catherine listened in silence, and when Sister Agnes finished, the old woman did something Sister Agnes never forgot. She closed her eyes, crossed herself, and said only 2 words. God help us. Then she stood up, and together, the 2 of them began to plan. And that is how the Rosen family came to live beneath the floor of the chapel in a crawl space that ran under the altar, a place so low that an adult could barely sit upright, a place where the only light came from a single candle that had to be extinguished the moment anyone set foot inside the church. In the beginning, the hiding was almost unbearable. The family could not speak above a whisper, and most of the time they did not speak at all, because the chapel was used every single day, and the sound of a human voice travels through wooden floorboards in ways you would never imagine until your life depends on staying silent. Little Jacob, who was 5 years old and had never in his life gone more than 5 minutes without shouting something, had to be taught that his voice could kill them all. His mother would press a finger to his lips and hold him close, and he would nod with wide, frightened eyes, and somehow, through some miracle of a child's understanding, he learned. He learned that silence was not a punishment but a kind of love. The days blurred together in that dark space, and the seasons turned above them while they stayed frozen beneath. Sister Agnes became their only link to the world of the living. She brought them food, small portions stolen from her own plate and hidden in the folds of her habit. She brought them water, and blankets, and scraps of paper for Hannah to practice her letters on. And every night, when the convent had gone dark and the other sisters were asleep, she would slip into the chapel, lift the loose board that only she and Mother Catherine knew about, and climb down into the earth to sit with them. She would tell them what the weather was like outside. She would tell them that the garden was doing well. She would tell them, in a steady voice, that they were going to survive this, and she would say it with such quiet certainty that even Leah, who had seen too much to believe in anything anymore, began, slowly, to believe her. And then there were the moments that almost broke them. The soldiers came to the convent 3 times over those 3 years, and each time, the family beneath the floor could hear every word, every boot step, every rough laugh from the men who were hunting people just like them. The first search happened only weeks after the Rosens arrived, and it was the worst, because none of them had learned yet how to be invisible. 2 soldiers walked through the chapel, their boots heavy on the very floorboards that separated the Rosen family from death, and Sister Agnes stood in the corner with her hands clasped, praying so hard her knuckles went white. And then, and this is the part that still makes the blood run cold, little Jacob, exhausted and frightened and only 5 years old, opened his mouth to cry. His mother clamped her hand over his mouth so fast that her palm struck his face, and she held him there, shaking, while the soldiers stood not 3 feet above them, while the whole world held its breath. The soldiers searched the pews. They searched the sacristy. They even moved the heavy statue of the Virgin Mary, and the sound of stone scraping on stone filled the chapel like thunder. But they never looked down. They never thought to look down. And when they finally left, and the doors swung shut behind them, the silence that followed was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. Sister Agnes climbed down that night and found Leah still holding Jacob, the 2 of them rocking together in the dark, and she sat beside them and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say. There are moments in this life when words are useless, and all you can do is sit in the dark with someone and let them know they are not alone. That was one of those moments. As the months stretched into years, something strange and beautiful began to grow in that cramped space beneath the chapel. The Rosen family and Sister Agnes, thrown together in the dark, stopped being strangers and became something closer to family. Samuel, the watchmaker, taught Sister Agnes how a clock works, explaining the gears and springs in a whisper, and she would sit there in the dark listening to him talk about timekeeping as if the 2 of them were sitting in his old shop on a lazy afternoon, not hiding in a hole in the ground. Hannah, who was growing fast in that hidden place, learned to read by candlelight, tracing the letters with her finger, and Sister Agnes would bring her whatever books she could smuggle down, always careful, always afraid that someone would notice a missing book and ask questions. And little Jacob, the boy who could not stop moving, would sit perfectly still while Sister Agnes told him stories about saints and miracles, stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, and it did not occur to any of them until much later that she was really telling him his own story. She was telling him, without ever saying it out loud, that he was part of something sacred now. That the darkness they lived in was not a grave but a kind of sanctuary. And in the winter of the second year, when the candles had to be rationed and the cold seeped up through the floor and into their bones, the family quietly celebrated Hanukkah in the dark, lighting a single small flame that they shielded with their bodies, and Sister Agnes sat with them and watched the light flicker on their faces, and she understood, maybe for the first time in her life, that God does not only live in churches. Sometimes God lives in a crawl space, in a single flame, in the stubborn refusal of 5 people to let the darkness win. But no amount of hope could stop the fear from finding them again. In the spring of the 3rd year, word reached the convent that someone in the village had been asking questions. No one knew who, and no one knew what they knew, but the danger was suddenly very close, closer than it had ever been. Mother Catherine called Sister Agnes to her office and told her, in a voice that did not waver, that the soldiers would be coming again, and this time it would not be a routine search. This time they were looking for something specific. Sister Agnes felt her heart stop, but she did not let it show. She simply nodded, and that night, she went down into the dark and told the Rosens the truth. She told them that they could not make a sound for the next 3 days. Not one sound. Not a cough, not a sneeze, not the scrape of a shoe against the dirt. And she looked at little Jacob, who was now 8 years old and far too big for the space that had held him since he was 5, and she made him promise. And Jacob, who had grown up in the dark, who had learned to be silent before he learned to read, looked back at her with eyes that were far too old for his face and said, in a whisper so soft it was almost a breath, "I promise." 2 days later, the soldiers came. There were more of them this time, and they did not bother to be polite. They tore through the convent room by room, pulling drawers out of desks, dumping the contents of closets onto the floor, and the sound of it echoed through the chapel like a storm. And then they came to the chapel itself, and this time, one of the soldiers, a young man with cold eyes and a cigarette hanging from his lips, stopped directly over the spot where the Rosen family lay. He stopped, and he looked down. And for one endless second, the entire world narrowed to the space between his boot and the floorboard. Sister Agnes, standing a few feet away, forced herself to breathe. She forced herself to look calm. She looked that soldier in the eye and said, in the most ordinary voice she could manage, that he was welcome to search anywhere he liked, and she would be happy to show him every corner of the convent herself. And maybe it was the steadiness in her voice. Maybe it was the way she did not flinch. Or maybe it was just luck, the kind of luck that no one can explain and no one should question. But the soldier looked at her, looked down once more, and then he turned and walked away. And when the soldiers were finally gone, and the doors had closed, Sister Agnes walked into the chapel, closed her eyes, and wept. She had held herself together for 3 years. She had been strong every single day, every single night, for the 5 people who were counting on her. And it was only then, alone in the empty chapel, that she let herself fall apart. Because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is being terrified and doing the right thing anyway, day after day after day, until the fear becomes so familiar it almost feels like a companion. The end, when it finally came, arrived the way spring always arrives, quietly, and then all at once. The occupation collapsed, the soldiers retreated, and the village began, cautiously, to breathe again. But the Rosen family did not come out from beneath the floor right away, because they had learned over 3 long years not to trust good news until it was standing right in front of them. It was Sister Agnes who came down that final morning, and she did not have to say a word. They could see it in her face, and for the first time in 3 years, they allowed themselves to believe it was over. They climbed out of the crawl space one by one, Samuel first, then Leah, then the children, blinking in a light so bright it hurt, and they stood in the chapel, in the open air, in the freedom they had prayed for every single night, and they did not know what to do with their own hands. The first thing Hannah did was run her fingers along the stone wall, as if she had forgotten what the world felt like. The first thing Jacob did was laugh a loud, bright, unguarded laugh, the first real laugh he had been allowed in 3 years. And Sister Agnes stood in the doorway and watched them, This family she had hidden and fed and lied for and nearly died for, and she felt something she could not put into words. It was not pride, exactly. It was something quieter than that. It was the knowledge that, for 3 years, beneath the floor of this chapel, she had helped keep a small piece of the world alive. The Rosen family eventually made their way to safety, to a new life in a new country, and Sister Agnes stayed behind in her convent, and she never spoke about what she had done, not to anyone, not for the rest of her life. She went back to scrubbing floors and tending the garden, and if you had passed her in the village, you would have seen nothing more than a quiet old nun with cracked hands and a bowed head. You would never have guessed that she was one of the bravest people you would ever meet. And that is the thing about the stories on this channel, the stories we tell here at The Secret Nun. The most extraordinary courage in human history almost never looks the way we expect it to look. It does not wear a uniform or stand on a stage. It looks like a woman with cracked hands and a bowed head, standing in a frozen doorway in the middle of a war, deciding that some things are more important than being safe. It looks like a mother holding her hand over her child's mouth while soldiers walk above them. It looks like a boy who learned to laugh quietly because his laughter could get his family killed. These are the stories that history almost forgets, the hidden stories, the ones that never make it into the history books, and that is exactly why this channel exists. So if you believe these stories matter, if you believe that the quietest acts of courage deserve to be remembered, then do one small thing for me right now: hit that subscribe button, because The Secret Nun is built for people like you, people who understand that the bravest people in this world are almost always the ones nobody noticed. And while you are at it, drop a comment below and tell me this: if you were in Sister Agnes's shoes, standing in that doorway on that freezing night, what would you have done? Would you have opened the door? I genuinely want to know, because I read every single comment, and I respond to as many as I can. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, then share it with one person. Just one. Send it to a friend, a mother, a daughter, someone who needs to be reminded that quiet courage is still courage. Because the reason the Rosen family survived is not just Sister Agnes. It is also the people who kept her secret, the Mother Superior who said God help us and then did the right thing, the other nuns who pretended not to notice the extra food disappearing from the kitchen. It was a chain of ordinary people refusing to look away. And every time you share a story like this, you become part of that chain too. You become part of the remembering. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about the stories the world forgot. If this video found you today, take it as a sign that you were meant to hear it. And remember this: somewhere, right now, there is a Sister Agnes walking quietly through the world, doing something brave that no one will ever see. Be the kind of person who notices. Be the kind of person who remembers. And I will see you in the next story.